When new games come out, reviews almost always talk about how good the graphics are, but great sound design can often go unappreciated. Sound is a huge part of what elevates a survival title like Subnautica from being a game about collecting rocks off the floor to a terrifying immersive experience about exploring an alien underwater planet. The noises made by the creatures bring the game's ecosystems to life. The fact that you can hear the sounds of dangerous animals from very far away gives certain zones a lingering sense of dread that sticks with you even after you leave. The sounds of breathing and bubbles floating past the camera makes the player feel like they're actually swimming through water. Many other sounds, like striking an object with a knife, are somewhat muffled, which further sells the idea that the player is underwater. It's easy to overlook all this due to how natural it feels, but both the quality and consistency of Subnautica's sound does a lot of the heavy lifting in making this world feel believable. Skyrim is filled with a rich tapestry of background sounds, making its forests and caves feel like real places with a distinct audio texture to them. According to a 2011 interview with Game Informer, audio director Mark Lampert would often go hiking in the forest to build up a library of sound effects that he thought might be useful for the game based off his experience as a sound designer. Later on, he would then select the sound effects he actually needed from the catalogue of sounds he had created. I think this shows the level of skill and effort required by sound teams to produce a truly great result. A well-designed soundscape can even serve as a navigational aid for players. In Dark Souls, the crackling noise made by bonfires lets the player know a checkpoint is close, and in classic Doom, the distant grunts made by demons act as both a warning of impending danger and as a subtle hint at which parts of the level are still unexplored. When sound design is done well, no one really notices. Hearing splashing noises as a character wades through water just sounds right, and it isn't until you take those sounds away do you realise how much of a difference seemingly mundane audio makes to the overall experience. Sound design in games extends beyond the gameplay itself into the menus and user interfaces. The best game UIs often feel like a natural extension of the game rather than a purely utilitarian interface slapped over the top of it. Subnautica's menus have high-pitched sci-fi beeps, which is obviously what computers will definitely sound like in thousands of years. The Pip-Boy's metallic clicks make it sound like a piece of old technology that actually exists within Fallout 4's world, which is completely different to the fantasy setting of Oblivion, where the menus sound like pages turning in a worn-out journal. The numbers vary depending on what source you look at, but humans react to visual stimuli, what you can see, in about 250 milliseconds, but only take around 170 milliseconds to react to sound, which is obviously much faster. Because of this, audio cues for certain enemy attacks are just as important as the visual telegraphs that you see. In Doom Eternal, many demons have distinctive sounds that the player can react to even if the enemy isn't on screen. The highly dangerous Cursed Prowler has a memorable screech that lets you know it has spawned, and each enemy's weapon sounds different, so skilled players know what foes are present and what attacks are being used just by the game's audio alone. Warning sounds can even be used to replace or supplement the heads-up display. Doom plays a warning beep noise whenever the player reaches low health, letting them know that they need to look for items without the need for the audience to keep their eyes glued to the health bar. In stealth games like Metal Gear Solid, communicating the state of guards is extremely important. In these games, enemies use voice barks to communicate their behaviours to the audience, such as when they're suspicious.
There's somebody there.
The game could, and does, just display this information visually on the radar, but do I want to spend the entire time looking at one corner of the TV? No, I want to look at the actual game, and using the voices to communicate the state of enemies rather than the UI feels way more natural. Sound is not only used to warn the player about danger, it's also used to make the player's successes feel more impactful. The noise that plays when you level up a skill in Skyrim or when you get a kill in Fallout 4 are the obvious examples. Big, loud, clearly noticeable sounds that reinforce the idea that you're doing something right. When the player breaks the enemy's stance and lands a more powerful critical hit in Elden Ring, the sound that accompanies this is much louder and more dramatic compared to when they land a normal attack. Destroying a weak point in Doom Eternal causes a satisfying which lets the player know they have disabled an enemy weapon with no ambiguity and no need to visually confirm the hit. Good player feedback sounds are often highly exaggerated to make absolutely sure that the player is aware of something. There's a part in Subnautica where the player needs to collect stalker teeth, which have a chance to fall out when that animal picks up scrap metal. It could be difficult to notice when this enemy drops a tiny little tooth, but there's a hugely exaggerated crunch sound that plays, which makes it far easier to notice when a tooth is dropped compared to relying on the visuals alone. Music is such a big part of what creates the atmosphere in many of the greatest games. Skyrim's soundtrack is iconic and gives the player a sense of being on a grand adventure in an alternate world with limitless possibilities. This perfectly encompasses what Bethesda wanted Skyrim to be as a game, even if the reality of its systems and balance doesn't always measure up to these lofty aspirations. When creating the music for Final Fantasy XIV's Heavensward expansion, sound director Masayoshi Soken used the game's story as inspiration. He explained that, in a video game, the player's experience is the most important thing, so he wrote the music to match the dark tone of the story, which was likely to reflect and enhance how players were feeling during different parts of the experience. Taking away music can also create tension and foreboding. Much of Half-Life's runtime has no background music, meaning that Gordon Freeman's worst day at the office is punctuated mainly by the player's own footsteps, weird alien sounds, and gunshots that echo off the walls of the Black Mesa complex, providing a feeling that the player is alone and out of their depth. It's a battle for survival, and every strange noise the player hears in the distance might be a monster lying in wait. Dark Souls also features no ambient music for most areas, which in a game as big as this one has the effect of making zones where you do hear music that much more impactful. The calming music of Firelink Shrine stands out because it's the only area in the entire game with that kind of soundtrack. Most of the music is saved for boss fights, and it's the contrast between the near silence of Dark Souls' dying world and the crescendos of its boss battles that makes those fights feel more climactic. When interviewed by GameSpot, Dark Souls composer Motoi Sakuraba said that the main challenge he had was trying not to break the game's atmosphere with his music, and that he communicated very closely with the producer and chose instruments very carefully in order to achieve this. The designers of Dark Souls showed a lot of restraint to only use music in the areas where it was really needed, which helps parts of that game to shine so much brighter than they would otherwise. So that's a few reasons why I think the work done by sound designers and musicians is underrated. Audio is a massive part of how games build believable environments and how they provide important information to players that affects decision making. As technology advances, the level of graphical fidelity in games gets better and more expensive every year, causing games from 2 decades ago to look downright decrepit in comparison to modern offerings. But the sound and music of those old games still hold up pretty well by today's standards. Good sound design has a timeless quality to it that the graphical elements of games may never be able to match, and if you ask me, that counts for an awful lot.